No, you're fine. We'll now call the City Council Planning Commission Workshop November 17, 2021 to order. It is 4:10. Roll call, please.
Member Shu?
Here.
Member Jafarian?
Here.
Member Askey?
Here.
Vice Chair Acevedo?
Here.
Chair Hedges?
Here.
Councilmember Hoffman?
Here.
Councilmember Grummeyer?
Here.
Councilmember Alleman?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Newton?
Here.
Mayor Bash?
Here.
All present. Thank you.
We will now do Pledge of Allegiance, led by yours truly. Ready to begin? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We will go to discussion item 1. Order presentation for discussion items, staff report presentation. 2, council questions of staff. 3, public comment. 4, council discussion and action. 1A, discussion of the creation of objective development standards applicable to properties with a housing development overlay, HDO, that were included in the 2021-2029 housing element update. Take it away.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, and members of the Planning Commission, thank you for joining us this evening. The purpose of this workshop is to basically get some feedback on the creation of objective development standards for specifically the Housing Development Overlay Zone and what could be SB 35 project as well. And with that, I am going to introduce our consultant. We have Alan Loomis with PlaceWorks. Is going to be coming to the podium, and he will take it from here. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Welcome. We do it by horseback all the time. Go.
Planning Director outlined the purpose of today's meeting, so I'm happy to be here. We're at the beginning of our process of crafting the design standards for you and working with city staff. We've done a little bit of a tour of the community. We've done some early kind of research with the planning staff on kind of the design standards and the criteria and the kind of boundaries by which you have to adopt design standards. And the purpose of today's meeting is to really get your input as the policymakers and advisors in the city on planning issues as to how we should craft those standards. Following this evening's conversation, we'll take information you provide us back to our office. We'll begin to write actual standards and sort of illustrate those standards and see how they could apply to the particular sites where multifamily is allowed in the community. And then we will subsequently, after a series of reviews with city staff, bring that back ultimately to the Planning Commission, who will make a recommendation then to the City Council, and the City Council will then subsequently adopt the standards. So that's where we're at in our process. So tonight, hopefully it'll be a kind of easygoing conversation because we're looking for all your best input and thought about the nature of the community and not actually asking you to offer a vote this evening. So it'll be a kind of, as I said, a study session format. So you have a copy of the PowerPoint on the table, but we'll kind of go through it on the screen in any event. So on slide 1, we're focused on developing objective design standards, principally for multifamily and mixed-use development. Now, of course, I know that you really haven't too much in the way of multifamily and mixed-use development here in Norco. It's a kind of development prototype that is not common in the community. But the key, 2 key reasons why you're tasked with doing this effort. The first is that through the state's adoption of SB 35, it does require you to adopt objective design standards if you want to impose any kind of design criteria on multifamily development that meets certain affordability thresholds. Those thresholds are relatively low, so a developer can walk in the door with relatively little, and by the way of affordability options within a development, and they automatically qualify as an SB 35 project. A mixed-use development that has a little bit of affordability also can qualify as an SB 35 project. So SB 35 is really kind of a reaction, I think, from the state in terms of thinking that somehow the sort of excessive kind of development reviews of housing projects is kind of delaying the production of housing and creating a kind of housing crisis, housing affordability crisis. And if you were to tell me you think the state is overreaching on this, you would not be alone amongst our clients and this statement. Every city is struggling with these kinds of requirements, but we do need to address them. The key reason why you as a community would want to address them by adopting objective design standards is that without them, you have no basis by which you can reject a project. And we'll get into what the objective design standards mean and why it's important that you draft them. But without any sort of objective design standards, a developer walks in the door with an affordable project and you're obligated to grant them approval. You can't bring them forward through a design review process under SB 35. So SB 35 is a state law. Every city in the state is struggling with this. We're working with a variety of communities and helping them develop their design standards. The second reason we're here tonight is that your recently adopted housing element calls for the adoption of objective design standards as one of the implementation actions. So you have a local reason why you're pursuing this path as well. So this is the plan, as a planning director indicated, is going to provide the kind of development criteria for your housing development overlay zones. We've got a map of those sites coming up. And there's a couple of another key thing with this is that it is going to, it does provide a CEQA exemption for any project that qualifies under this. That is to say, you're not going to be able to do any sort of CEQA level review, EIRs, et cetera, that you might be accustomed to applying to larger projects once these standards are in place. So what are objective design standards? Well, the key thing is that it forgoes the kind of typical language we see in design guidelines and design review process, which is that design guidelines will often say you should be compatible with surrounding neighborhoods. The front door should be located towards the sort of main intersection. You should be designed in a Western architecture theme. That language should is now a prohibited term. Anything that's kind of wishy-washy in that term and open to interpretation is no longer allowed. So one of the key things we've been doing when we've been writing objective design standards is looking at existing design guidelines the community has, and to the extent that we can translate any shoulds into shalls and make it a mandatory statement as opposed to a suggested statement, that's a really easy pathway by which we can create objective design standards. So all the statements that you have in your design standards should be shalls, not suggestions. They're requirements. The second bullet here then means is kind of a follow-up to that, which is that those requirements do need to be measurable and quantifiable to the extent that you can provide numbers to them and give them a numeric value. That is to say, like, for example, like a porch, instead of saying a porch should be approximately 6 feet deep, you say a porch shall be at least 6 feet deep. So you give those kinds of measurements. So requirements that are measurable, quantifiable is you can still have. So one of the things we've looked at and we've been doing with other communities is sometimes we'll provide a range of options. So we'll give a whole series of design elements that a project is required to meet. And there might be, say, like 8 of them. And we say with a checklist, the project shall provide at least 6 of those design criteria. Other communities have done things on a points criteria. So there might be half a dozen different design or dozen different design criteria. Each one grants you 1 point, and then you have to, as a developer or an architect, accumulate a certain number of points, like 7 points, in order to meet the design standards. So the objective design standards are really geared towards this kind of approach. The other important thing with this, and this is part of the state law, is that it creates a pathway for an administrative or ministerial review process. So typically in most communities, you have some form of design review process. A developer or an architect comes to town, they present their project, they stand in front of a body like you or some subcommittee of you as a planning commission or design review board. You look at the project and your professional expertise, understanding of the community, say, building's too tall, modify it this way, it needs to be a little bit different color, different materials, et cetera. You have that kind of dialogue. And that's the pathway by which a project gets approved. With objective design standards, that administrative or that hearing, if you will, is basically removed. The idea with objective design standards is that a developer can come to the door with their application. It's presented at the planning counter, the permit counter. One of your trusted planning staff can go through the design standards, check off all the boxes of the objective design standards that the project has met, and they're granted approval right then and there, effectively. Because it is a ministerial review process and there's no hearing, it's therefore not considered a CEQA project. So that's where I said you also now will no longer have this kind of tool of using CEQA or an EIR process to get other kinds of design features out of a project. So the key thing for this, from the state's perspective in terms of expediting housing production, is that this is a very simplified pathway for a developer who's going to bring affordable housing into the state or to your community. Now has a very easy pathway for getting their project approved. And I know you're not like this, but you know the horror stories you hear of like a community like Santa Barbara, you know, where a developer has gone through 35 separate hearings to get their housing project developed, and it's taken them 6 years to just get the project approved. You know, that's kind of the sort of, I think, one of the case studies that the state's really sort of zeroing in on. It's like, come on, just, you know, you need affordable housing in Santa Barbara, get on with it and improve it. So this objective design process is really intended to sort of circumvent those kind of egregious kinds of reviews. So in your case, it also is important that you adopt these standards because, as I said, if a developer shows up with a project that has some affordability component and is considered an SB 35 project, in the absence of having adopted design standards, city planning staff has to approve that project, even if it's really awful and really ugly and has nothing to do with the city of Norco. So our purpose in drafting these design standards is to try and embody in these standards that staff would be implementing a certain, you know, the sort of characteristics that are appropriate to Norco and that you'd like to see out of kind of future development that might meet this threshold. It's also important here, too, to say that once the standards are adopted, you're not allowed then to impose additional requirements onto a project. So if the project meets the objective design standards, they should be granted approval. You can't say, well, you know, we need to make it a little shorter, or the setback needs to be a little bit deeper here. Project meets the standards, it should be granted approval. There's no further kind of negotiation that should be applied. So it's important that we really give the objective design standards, you know, due consideration, and that we draft something that feels appropriate to the community. You are fortunate compared to some of our other clients and communities that we've worked with that you have relatively few sites where affordable or multifamily housing can even be built under your adopted housing element and the proposed zoning associated with the housing element. Multifamily housing is actually going to be restricted to a very few sites. So there's these 2 sites that are kind of across the street here from City Hall, that Hamner and 4th and Town and Country. And so the development proposed density and the housing elements kind of outlined there. And then there are 2 other sites at 2nd and River. And you know, in each case, both sites is actually 2 separate parcels. So it's a total of 16 parcels, but really 4 separate sites where multifamily housing would be permitted under the housing development overlay zone. So from our perspective as the designers who are going to develop these standards, this is actually a huge advantage because we can actually think about very specific sites and the kind of development criteria and kind of the setbacks, et cetera, that might be associated with those particular sites. Whereas in other communities where we're looking at hundreds of sites, we have to really think more abstractly in terms of crafting the design standards. So this focus on these few sites is actually an advantage, I think, and kind of exciting for us as the design team to think specifically as opposed to just abstractly. Another kind of key criteria that was made very clear by Alma when she first contacted us is that you have a very clear Western architecture theme in the community. And some of the other communities we've worked with, we have tried to develop architectural design standards, or architectural style standards, I should say, so that we provide some criteria for how the specific architectural styles those communities would like to see. We include those into the design standards. So part of our scope of work is to develop a style book and provide specific standards for your Western architectural style that is part of the community. We're fortunate that in your design review chapter of your municipal code, you already have a number of standards, and so that's going to be our starting point, is to look at that set of standards and begin to expand upon it as we develop our styles, standards and here. And this will be, we'll also be illustrating it, which I think is also what I've heard is kind of a challenge right now, that because your code is all words, oftentimes somebody shows up and there's this conversation, what does Western architecture mean? So we're going to provide a lot of illustrations as part of our work in providing us providing this description. So I think that would be helpful to you in many different ways. It'll be a kind of interesting challenge, because I think most of the examples that we've seen, and certainly most of the examples here in Norco of this Western architecture theme, are really applied to commercial buildings principally, not so much to multifamily buildings. So, this is kind of the exciting challenge for us as designers to sort of, this will be a fun challenge to sort of think and find prototypes for kind of Western architecture style applied to multifamily development. But this is really one of the kind of givens that we were offered when we when we were hired by city staff. So the other interesting challenge that we've been presented with, and kind of the key reason we wanted to discuss, talk with you this afternoon, is that, as you probably know, you actually don't have any zoning standards really for multifamily development. And so part of our scope is to help to develop some zoning standards that will be really built into these design standards for multifamily and mixed-use development. So right now you mostly have standards related to sort of single-family agriculture and commercial development, but you really have not given a good deal of thought, I think, to the standards you'd want to apply to multifamily development, because you haven't seen any of it. And so as part of this exercise, we'd be looking at developing a set of basic design standards, effectively zoning standards, for multifamily development. So the 2 pages we have here, and I'll just skip to the next one and then come back, is really the kind of principal, kind of key high-level sort of standard discussions, kind of topics that you would address here. And so we've got an initial proposition that in some cases is coming from other parts of your zoning code, other cases are from recently adopted standards, other cases it's kind of a suggestion. And so we'll go through these, and then the big kind of part of the discussion today would be to actually get your input on some of these design standards, to the extent you have opinions on them. So I will say, before we sort of jump into this discussion, at the end of the day, when our project is delivered, what you'll receive is a design standards document. It'll be a freestanding book. It'll be richly illustrated, as I said, with good examples of Western architecture. It will provide criteria for site planning, criteria for overall building design in terms of the height and massing. It will include these style standards for the Western architecture theme. It will also include these sets of standards. The way it will ultimately be implemented is planning staff will need to come back with a minor and strategic amendment to the zoning code that will say, if you walk in the door with an SB 35 project, your entitlement pathway goes through these design standards as adopted by resolution by City Council. Those design standards will sort of then be an additional document like your general plan or other kind of policy documents you would have available at the counter. So this will be a standalone document. Now, the other thing that'll be kind of very useful for you, I think, is that while they are being designed specifically for these affordable housing developments under SB 35 and your housing element, it'll be a tool that you can refer to for other kinds of projects too. Like I said, planning staff could open up to it and say, this is what we mean by Western architecture. When we say a bracket, it looks like this. When we say this kind of stone or board and batten, for those architects who are confused. I was trained as an architect, and I would hope most architects would understand what board and batten and a knee bracket is, but you never know. So I'll come back and go through this, and then I'll turn it over to the mayor to facilitate the conversation and kind of discussion. So in terms of permitted heights, we're suggesting that you do 2.5 stories at the edge of these large sites. But because these sites are so large, we think that with some appropriate setback from the street face, and appropriate meaning, probably in the multiple tens of feet, so 25 feet plus or so. You could go up to 30 or 3 stories in the interior of these parcels. Part of this is because the level of density that you're trying to achieve in these sites for your housing element is going to be very challenging to achieve at 2 stories with all surface parking. I don't think you're in the kind of development world where underground parking is really going to be affordable. You can get 30 units an acre, 35 units an acre, and 2 stories if you do all your parking underground, but that of course is very expensive. Comes with a lot of extra kind of challenges in terms of moving all that dirt around. It's unlikely a developer is going to show up in Norco and just say, I'm going to build underground parking. They're going to probably want to do surface parking with garages or kind of parking lots. And to achieve 20 units an acre and 2 stories with a lot of surface parking is going to be very challenging. So we think allowing developers to go up to 3 stories once they're in the interior of these large parcels is an appropriate standard. We're looking at the permitted lot coverage. The maximum that the particular lot could be covered with building footprint at 60%. So it's a little over 50%. This is another kind of hedge against this height. If you were to say you want it to be only 2 stories as your max height, we'd probably have to look at increasing the permitted lot coverage. So more of the site could be covered by buildings. That of course means there's less space for greenery and kind of green space on the property. That's, kind of the trade-off that one would have to make. We're looking at providing some set of standards for the distance between individual buildings, and we typically like to have these sort of scale up, so as the taller the buildings get, the more that distance is. So we don't necessarily think that you want to have a lot of buildings sort of packed in right next to each other with, like this 3-foot setback between one another where you can't even have windows between the 2 buildings. We think you ought to have a kind of more gracious sort of setback between individual buildings. We're also looking at, appropriate setbacks and fences when you approach up against this sort of non-multifamily lots, particularly when you approach up to the R1 or agricultural lots. So what kind of fencing is appropriate? I believe this 10-foot tall masonry wall is kind of captured from your commercial code. We'd also need to address the amount of off-street parking and development is required to bring. And so these numbers, 1.5 spaces required for studio or 1-bedroom units, 2 parking spaces required for 2-bedroom units, 2.5 spaces required for 3-bedroom units is pretty typical. And these kinds of sort of environments similar to Norco. There's also a requirement that there be for every unit 0.25 spaces provided for guests. So that means, every 4 units there should be 1 parking space for guests on site, not on the street. And then at least for every unit should be also provided 1 covered parking space. So it's not just a sea of it's not just a big parking lot, that 1 covered parking space is in a carport or a garage. The other one, another one that's important to define is the minimum size for any given unit, dwelling unit or a residential unit. So 500 square feet is kind of recently been adopted in your code under a recent ordinance, so we're just sort of carrying that forward. Usable open space is another important one. So here the recommendation is 80 square feet per unit, and that and this is private open space to the unit with a minimum depth of 6 feet. So this ensures that that 6-foot depth ensures that you don't end up with these kind of really narrow balconies where the only thing that somebody can do with it is, store their bikes and their other junk. They actually can't use the balcony. 6 feet is deep enough that you could get a small table out there. You could actually use that balcony or a porch if it's located at the ground floor. So having some standards for minimum open space per unit that's assigned to that unit and a kind of size criteria we think is important. And then lastly, another important consideration that tends to get overlooked is lighting. And so we've generally been, in other documents we've been preparing, is that we've been providing examples of appropriate lighting to the architectural styles and establishing a kind of maximum height for any lighting poles. If you're going to have parking lots and drive aisles, you're going to have oftentimes lighting mounted on poles. You don't want those poles to be too high, so we're saying 15 feet should be the maximum height. and that lighting be directed downward with shielding, so you're not having this kind of glowing sky effect provided by the lighting. So lighting is something that's important to think about. A lot of times architects like to draw their buildings during the daytime, but of course, buildings like us spend half their life in the dark. And so lighting is an important thing, especially as it's pushing 5 o'clock in the winter and it's already starting to get dark. So when we all leave, it'll be dark outside and we'll be paying attention to lighting. So with that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to have conversation, discussion, suggestions for standards, things we haven't thought about in terms of standards you'd like us to look into and consider. Can go back to the other 2 slides. But with
All
that,
right,
thank you.
Danny, let's start with you. You have any comments, questions?
Come back to me. Let me think
Okay.
more about this. I'm going to pass right now.
All right. Bill?
Just a couple thoughts, and it does have to do specifically with the sites we're talking about, and I wonder if if there isn't a necessary application of a commercial standard to those areas that buffer the commercial. We make a regulation, or there's a suggestion on the table about where we come up against a residential, but I think it's there's an equal importance that we support our commercial businesses and that frontage, that commercial. That it appears as though it's got respect for its commercial neighbors in those commercial cases, because both of these have commercial frontage. So that was one of my first thoughts. The second one is I don't see a landscape requirement in here, and typically in our other non single family residential work, we've got some form of a landscape requirement as a percentage, and sometimes we state the size and nature of the landscape based on the overall. The other thing, the only other thing, and this is still an initial idea, was the on the lighting, that we've probably got 3 different types of lighting. We've got the pole mounted area lighting, we've probably got some kind of building lighting, and then we've probably got landscape lighting. And those may very well have different characters, and some may be controlled or not controlled by the unit, the tenant. Those were my initial thoughts. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Phil. Greg?
Just a couple questions to start. The premise that I look at this is first addressing community design. Is that applicable with affordable housing and SB 35?
Can you clarify sort of what you might mean
Yeah, I'll
by
give it.
community
It's out
design?
of our. Actually, it's pertinent to our land use agreement or land use element that direct development towards a goal that unifies the community through design cohesion between natural and built environments.
We can make an effort at addressing that through these design standards, for sure.
Okay. And then as we get further into this, on some of these standards, and I don't know how far in the weeds you want to go on this, but on the standards like on height, you had like 2.5 stories on the perimeter. I guess I can ask our on-board architects, what's a half story? If I take a story at 10 foot,
I'm making an assumption, but you could certainly clarify it. My assumption is that it's some form of a gabled roof or something. It's effectively a 2-story, but it's got a something. Maybe it's got an outdoor area or something else that's out there that extends it a little bit. Yeah.
Or a deck.
Yeah.
so then would we assume that a 2.5 story is 25 feet tall?
I think that's probably a reasonable assumption.
Okay.
Before I start answering, let me ask the mayor, would you like me to engage in dialogue?
Oh,
with
yeah,
the
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me address that. I want to come back to previous kind of comments. 2.5 stories, I think the comment from your resident architect is correct. You'd probably assume that at 2.5 stories, you have an occupied roof, so it's a kind of attic unit, a unit that's inside the gable and maybe it has a dormer popping out. That could be considered 2.5 stories, probably as a 25-foot high
Okay,
structure.
so we could say that instead of 2.5, we could say at the perimeter, max height 25 feet to ridge or top of parapet.
Yeah, and I think that's an appropriate kind
Okay.
of standard that we would want to be clear about where that height is
Right.
measured to.
And then the same as say like on the 3-story,
Correct.
35 feet to top of ridge and or top of parapet.
Correct. And it may be that it's more appropriate for you to say what the maximum height is to ridge line in terms of feet as opposed to number of stories, because stories
Right.
could be kind of open to some degree of interpretation, I think.
Okay.
Whereas feet it's pretty clear. You get a tape measure and that's that. So we could reevaluate kind of our criteria there in terms of that height.
And then on, like on the lighting, would we still be able to require like photometric plans?
You would have to have some degree of some sort of standards written in that would sort of trigger the photometric plans. So for example, I've worked in communities where they require that lighting is not allowed to exceed 3,000 degree Kelvin, so that the lighting is very yellow and kind of soft, as opposed to that really, especially in residential, so it doesn't exceed that sort of, doesn't get that really harsh blue light that you see in commercial development. So you could certainly write that into the criteria because that's pretty measurable in terms of the ultimate specs.
So like where
There's
we,
a certain degree, there's a certain degree of photometrics that would need to be provided because any sort of landscaping by building code and safety code is going to have to meet a certain kind of criteria.
Right. Well-
But if you wanted to say you didn't want to exceed it by a certain measure, we'd have to write that criteria into the plan.
so like where we say, like adjoining a R1 or an A1 lot, 10-foot masonry wall, but then with that photometric, could you also have the condition that let's say you don't have more than a half a foot candle that bleeds over onto that adjoining existing residential property?
Yeah, that'd be
I
a
guess
very-
that's kind of where I'm going to.
That'd be, if you wanted to put that, that'd be a measurable standard you could include.
Okay.
For sure.
I have a whole bunch, but I'll just let it.
If I may, before you move on, Mr. Mayor, go back to previous comments. The comment about appropriate setback to commercial, I think we can look into that. I see the point that somebody is going to develop in housing, somebody's going to move into housing, and then if they're adjacent to commercial and they don't have an appropriate setback, potentially have a problem. That new resident is complaining about the business that's been there forever, keeping them up at night, for example. And so I think having some consideration of setbacks relative to existing commercial is probably an appropriate thing to look at. We can look at landscape requirements. If you have existing standards in your code, we can dive into that and sort of pull out the appropriate things there so that you are requiring a certain amount of vegetation per certain percentage of your required open space, so you don't just get a sea of concrete. And you're correct about the 3 different types of lighting, so we'll address those 3 different types. Although you did bring up the point that if there is a light fixture mounted on a building over a balcony, that very likely is controlled by the person in the unit, so that goes on and off as the person in the unit wants to turn that light on and off.
Anything else, Greg? Catherine?
Okay, I have a few things as well. Just kind of try to start higher level. In terms of height, building height, at least one of the sites does butt up to residential zone. Can there be a requirement where I've seen in other zoning that the height along the perimeter is required to be lower when it is bordering single-family home neighborhoods? So for instance, 1 story, or it needs to be a little further in if it's going to be, the higher it's going to be if it's next to homes.
Yeah, we can certainly address that.
Okay. Landscaping as well. The use of landscaping to buffer privacy for both the residents who live within the units, and again, if it's butting up to other residential zoned areas. Recreational facilities. can we put in these requirements? I've seen if if there are, for example, a minimum of 10 units, that there's a requirement to have a play area or a space for a community or residential garden. Or if there are a minimum of 20 units, that there must be an indoor recreational facility available to the residents.
We can include that too. You're in some ways, because you don't have any existing multifamily development standards, we're starting from scratch. So
Right.
this is the perfect time to put all that on the table and
Okay.
write that in.
Okay. I think one of the other things, just general, looking at minimizing large structures and that they be compatible with the scale of surrounding development as much as possible. And then if it is a mixed use, looking at how to enhance pedestrian interaction with that nearby commercial activity in a way that makes sense. I imagine the residents would be, you know, depending on what that commercial activity is, patronizing those.
You know, if I may, on the mixed use, we'll be thinking about two different kinds of mixed use development. One is, you know, from where I work in downtown LA, the typical mixed use development, which is housing on top of a ground floor commercial use. But what we see a lot of in kind of in this part of the region is development where there's housing and then there's a commercial pad with a Starbucks or something sitting out on the corner. It's submitted as one project. It's all on one site, but they're really two separate buildings and kind of two separate tenancies and operations. That's probably the more likely kind of mixed-use development I think you'll see on these particular sites. So we're going to think about that in addition to the traditional vertical mixed use.
Definitely. And either way, I think however it works to enable pedestrians to get between the two would be my preference as well, to promote that in a way that makes sense for both those entities. Thank you.
I just had a question, and what kind of perked my interest is, what exactly is the required target per the state legislature? So for example, when you said that underground parking, you probably wouldn't get developers coming to town. Are we allowed to put in and require underground parking?
You could require underground parking.
Why are we not doing that?
It is very expensive. I will say in Pasadena, their multifamily zoning code, it actually doesn't require underground parking per se. But as a practical matter, what happens is the lots are so small, because they're generally small infill lots, the allowable zoning density you can get on those lots is close to 30 units an acre. And they have criteria for having a certain amount of open space.
Who has criteria? Pasadena?
City of Pasadena, in their zoning code, their criteria for a certain amount of open space that's located at the ground level, the sidewalk level. That combination of standards means that virtually every development that arrives is doing underground parking. And of course, Pasadena can kind of support those kinds of the kind of costs that are associated with that. That being said, Pasadena does have a pretty significant affordable housing problem. But
Well, as we know, this isn't going to solve anything. So my question though is that what are the things that we're forced to do? In other words, can we say everything has to be street level? It can't be put up on I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn this damn thing off. So can we legitimately say we want everything street level, we want underground parking, we want setbacks of 50 feet? Is there a requirement that we have to do? And I'm just asking, I mean, I don't know. Is there a requirement that says we have to build 10, 20, 30 units per acre or half acre or whatever? I mean, is there a reason that we have to, if we have these design elements in place, it would be expensive to build the apartments? Is that on us? I mean, is our goal to help the developer who already has all the cards on his side to say, yeah, you know what, we don't want underground parking to cost you so much money, dear developer? As you realize, and I'm sure you know this, Norco, because of our large lots, is a target. And so we're very concerned about how do we make these large we want affordable housing, we understand all that. But do we have to lay out the red carpet? I mean, what exactly do we have to do to comply with the law?
That is a very good question. I understand where you're coming from on that. And I think the long-term answer to that is if you were to write criteria that was so onerous that nobody could develop to it, and a developer could say it's just financially infeasible to do this housing in Norco, the next cycle of your housing element update, the state would come in and say, your regulations are too restrictive.
That's 10 years from now, right?
Yeah.
So,
Now, could you-
but my experience, forgive me for interrupting. I've been involved in multiple developments in the city of Norco, and part of the reason our heroes in Santa Barbara took so long was because the developer kept crying, "Oh, that's too hard." They always say that. And so I guess, because I think in 10 years all these laws will be gone. I think the cities are going to finally stand up. When people start seeing all these units next door to them, they're going to go, whoa. But do we have a list of things that the state says we must do? I mean, underground parking sounds feasible when you're trying to blend into architecturally with the city of Norco, because I mean, you have houses that are single story, and you're going to build a 2-story, 2.5-story building right next door to it. It would seem to me that the bigger the buffer, it fits in with the open space of the community. I mean, one of the things that's missing from that is open space. If you go down Hamner Avenue, look at all the open space, and that's our commercial district. You have huge lots, and I think that that's one of the things that maybe we could push on. And then the other thing, my last question, the 1.5 spaces, that's always weird to me, because that means you have 2 spaces. Or does it mean that you have 1 space per 3, and then why can't you just have 2 spaces? Or is it, do you see what I'm saying? In other words,
Yep.
it's kind of stupid.
I think, let me answer that one. I think
Yeah.
my experience with that is that what that translates into is that for 2 one-bedroom units, you end up with 3 spaces, and it gives the tenants or whoever's renting that out or potentially selling those units some degree of flexibility to say this unit gets 1 space, this one gets 2, or you as a tenant are guaranteed 1 space per unit. If you'd like an extra space, you're going to rent that at a separate cost, and it might be a lottery based on the availability of those potential spaces. I think from a pragmatic
So once again, we're
standpoint,
helping the developer. I mean, I'm not really understanding why I have to help the developer. I understand your argument there, but I don't understand why are we helping him so much. I mean, I'm not trying to be draconian, but I am trying to protect a community that has a certain, you've been here now, you know what it looks like.
Yeah. And to address your second question, I will have to come back and sort of see if there's any sort of like really strict minimum criteria relative to the standards that would say you're not allowed to sort of impose underground parking as one of your design criteria. I think probably the way to address this is your comment about open space, and to say that you do want to see in your standards a certain kind of percentage of open space or visibility from the street or between individual units. You don't maybe want to see all that parking come from the street, so you're forcing the parking to go inside. And that, as in the case of Pasadena in a much more urban context, that combination of criteria begins to really limit where parking can go. It may trigger the developer to say, I need to put this parking underground. And so that may be a more appropriate way of doing it, because then you can justify those criteria, if you will, by sort of preserving community character that's important, that's important to you, as opposed to just saying, we want to have underground parking and make it expensive for
Well, no, I mean,
developers.
the point is my understanding is we're the last city in the state of California, by law, you have to build on a half acre or more. That's what we're trying to protect. So why can't we somehow figure out a way to put that into our design standards? Anyway, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. You got where I'm coming from.
I do. I totally understand. I think we owe you a response on that.
Okay.
You are not required, I will say this, you're not required to submit these objective design standards up to the state, HCD, for approval the way you are with a housing element. So the state doesn't get to look at this and go, that's too much. So you have some more local autonomy in this case than you have in some of the other housing issues that the state's been legislating on lately.
Cool. Robin?
I agree with all the speakers before me. The only other thing that I'd like to maybe add is we think about affordable housing. Hopefully that's attracting young families with children, and so making sure that we have amenities for children, and then specifically with our goal to protect this rural and agrarian lifestyle, I would request, if we can at all, have facilities or amenities that would encourage that. So maybe the ability for, a chicken coop or some type of trails, or, beyond the community garden, something a little bit more substantial. I always say chickens are like the gateway animal for livestock. So if we can start people on chickens, then they'll move up to the larger livestock. And I really do think the goal of affordable housing is to kind of get people in the door, get them incorporated to our community and our lifestyle, where they're going to then move on to buying a bigger lot and getting more animals and raising their family here and those type of things. So, while it's probably not a common development standard, I think having chicken coops or a greenhouse or some of those types of things, or, think big, a stable or something, and I know that's going to decrease potentially the density. So that's on my wish list, though, is to have those types of amenities.
Yeah, I think as you say that, one of the things we could include as part of the standards, I'm thinking out loud, is a list of community amenities to the housing development. Like you might have a swimming pool or a tennis court, and we could include a list, and we could that is a optional list. So there's a range of things, and the developer has to provide one for every 10 units or two for every 20 units, something like that. And we could include these kind of agrarian features. So a developer who's sensitive to the nature of the community hopefully would say, I'll put in a chicken coop, or, and we can make it so that they don't default to community gardens if, you want to go a step beyond. Your comment about chicken coops is, I find it, I just started a compost bin. I'm worried that's a gateway to some larger form of agriculture at my house.
Ted?
Thank you. You mentioned the, I'm like the rest of I like the height requirements, the smaller to the larger, but we definitely don't want to do anything over 35 feet as anything like that. And then we always get that person that wants the variance. I think that's what we need to say no. And I don't know if you can incorporate that in there where we don't allow that person to put that 50-foot tall building in the middle of it. So that I would like to see that, maybe if you can, there's not going to be any variance in this thing, so we don't have that unusual structure.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, because the intent of this is that the developer is meeting the criteria, they get the permit. As soon as they themselves decide they don't want to meet their criteria, and now they're in front of the planning commission for a variance, all bets are off, in a sense. Now they're through your normal process that you're accustomed to.
Okay, I just make sure you address that.
Yeah.
You mentioned the mixed use and on these projects, and you talked about Pasadena. You look at some of our old western cities and towns in bygone days. Actually, there was commercial on the bottom, and the store owner lived above that. And that's not unusual, and it's not an unusual concept, and actually works as long as you don't keep that high story like they have in LA and downtown, where those are 3- and 4-story buildings atop of that commercial district. I'm not opposed to that, so I don't think we should ignore that going with that open market like that was proposed to us before. I'm just looking at that as a better use of space and getting that structure in there.
Yeah, I think in that particular case, we'll have good examples. You don't have to go too far down to 15 to go to Old Town Temecula.
Yeah.
And that's a great example of a mixed-use environment that has this.
And that would, I think, be more appealing to the average resident in this town. I've seen it. Now, the one thing that, when we have those mixed uses and we have that commercial area, then you worry about the privacy type of thing, and that masonry wall or that 10-foot wall was something that would actually look ugly in the middle of something like that. So we'd want to avoid that type of thing, where you did have that sort of like the open air type of thing. So, I'm with Robin on the open space and the lot coverage. You got to have that. But what I'm also concerned about is you've got 15 feet side to side for distance between buildings. I would imagine we should probably look at our fire life safety people to see if that is for them, especially if we get the taller structures, how they can maneuver and the trucks and things like that. That would be my concern. I think 15 feet is not adequate at all.
Yeah, and it's important to say that these design standards do not and will not preempt kind of the building code, fire life safety codes, or other kind of like requirements for fire lane access that might come from your fire department. So,
Okay, and then I'm kind of like with Kevin on your off-street parking, and I'm just curious, where does that source come from, the 1.5? I mean, there is a standard used somewhere.
yeah, I'm with you on kind of the mystery of where these parking criteria come from.
And there is because when I went through all my crime prevention through environmental design, you get a 1-bedroom, you figure there was going to be 2 people in it. On a 2-person, there was 2-bedroom was 3 people, or on and on. We just added on there. So I just don't understand where a studio apartment or 1-bedroom apartment is going to probably have 2 adults. So you're already half a parking space short.
Yeah, I mean, they could also have 1 adult, which I think is where the 1.5 comes
Yeah,
from.
and
There's
yeah.
studies of how many parking spaces per kinds of land use, and then that all gets aggregated in like an insurance company, and they sort of come back and give you these numbers.
That was my question on that one. And then I like your idea with the 6-foot minimum depth. And then your lighting, and this is something we all need to consider, no matter, not only in your housing, but in all our lighting. We're going to get charged, starting November 1st, you're getting charged different on your electrical bills. You're getting charged the time of use thing, where your rates are going to be higher in the evening. So you're talking about lighting and lighting types and things like that. You're going to see whole different lighting schemes out there, and something we should probably incorporate in all our, because Southern California Edison's already gone to that, where you used to be you washed your clothes at night so you wouldn't affect during the heat all the power usage. But now that's all changed, because with all the renewable energies and these alternative energy sources, they're relying on solar and wind and things like that, and the over impact on the electrical for the grid in the evening time is now critical. Battery power is not going to last. So I think we really need to look at these lighting situations, even though all these new housing developments will be required to have solar panels in them as per state law. You're going to still have a higher usage, so we have to be careful on their lighting, and I think that should play into our density added too, is how many people you're going to have and per square footage. And it's going to take more than us, because this is all new down the pipeline, but that is going to affect density on these lots and how many people you can have, because how many people can you have your power grid support them? We're already got a water shortage too, so that's another part of the equation that's going to be in there. So I think we can incorporate that all in, and this is what we're going to do. And I know it's part of I've gone off a little bit on a different tangent, but I think it's all impactful.
Yeah, we can consider that. Off the top of my head, as you're speaking, I'm not quite sure how the design criteria and those issues of lighting sort of interweave with developing standards for what kind of light fixtures somebody put on.
Well, it's not just the light fixtures. It's the time of use, the lights, and how much we're going to have. And everybody wants adequate lighting. Don't get me wrong, but it comes down to the point where you've got our energy providers telling us to cut back now in the evening, so you don't put a impact on the grid. Now we're just talking about lighting, so we have adequate. I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
I think it's something that we all need to consider in our developmental standards. Thank you.
Pat?
Hi, off of that, could we require that the developer use solar lighting?
If I'm not mistaken, that already is a requirement that you have to have solar lighting, and as
I'm just saying that because we've looked at a couple and they did not have solar lighting when they brought it to us. So I'm just thinking it might be good to put in the development standards if beyond the state law as a requirement. I love the chicken coop idea, by the way.
Yeah.
The only other thing I had right now was that you had said that we didn't really have any standards for the Western style architecture, but we did for multifamily, but we did require it for hotels. Can we just use that similar type of thing?
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said you don't have any criteria. It's not that you don't have criteria, because you do have that criteria in
Right,
the
but
code,
we
but it's
can-
not, you don't have good,
Don't have it
you don't have the
specific to-
illustrations.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Thank you, that's all for right now.
A couple things. Hi. One thing you said earlier was in mixed-use developments, people often put the Starbucks in with the housing units as all one plan. Does that mean that it doesn't mean that a mixed-use development like that would get automatic administrative approval for the commercial portion of it, right?
It can,
They can?
provided they bring the required percentage of affordable to the residential component. The commercial now gets the similar expedited administrative review.
So,
That's kind of the reason we've been including mixed-use standards in a lot of these.
so then we need design standards that would apply to the commercial, perhaps separate from the ones that would apply to the residential.
Yeah, quite possibly. That's an obvious conclusion to that
Okay.
statement.
And then I think somebody said that earlier, but I would agree that permitted heights, there should be maybe three, and permitted height should be lower or larger setback if it overlooks a residential area. The wall fences and structures, I don't know that, we might want to look at whether or not we'd always want a 10-foot tall masonry wall under those circumstances, or whether we'd want a couple of options. I don't know if it aesthetically, if the masonry wall would be the best option to go in to all circumstances. Off-street parking, I'd just like to see more. I just think it should be studio 2 spaces, 2-bedroom 3 spaces, 3-bedroom 4 space. I mean, I just think there should be a larger requirement for off-street parking. That does a couple of things, but some of these areas, we just don't have the space for on-street parking if there's not enough parking spaces in the development. So I think that should be higher. I also don't like the size of the dwellings, minimum 500 square feet. 500 square feet is a hotel room. You put a bathroom and a kitchen in a hotel room and you don't have much left over. I realize studio apartments are small, but 500 square feet is really small. I just think we should maybe consider making that number a little bit higher. Thought I had one other thing, but I don't see it, so I think that's all.
Okay,
for now.
let me address the 500 square feet. Some communities have worked in the minimum unit size increases as the number of bedrooms increases. So you'd say like 500 square feet for your studio or 1 bedroom, but if you go to a 2-bedroom unit, it's now 800 square feet or 750 square feet. So that's a possibility we could look into.
Okay, thanks.
Jeff?
And I'm sorry, we can look at some options other than block walls. So.
I've got questions on 2 general areas that have been kind of hit on before, but one of them is, as we've been talking about, the off-street parking. And rather than just kind of the numbers, one of the things I like to see is something more Norco specific. And what I mean by that is if you go around town and you look at the people and the cars that they drive, I'd like to see us drastically limit how many compact spaces are allowed. And more than that, I'd like to see some additional requirement put into our city requirement for large vehicle parking. And that may just be large cars and trucks, but beyond that, maybe some sort of allowance for trailer parking. Because part of it is we're talking about animal keeping. And it doesn't mean that we have to make amenities for every single unit, but we should have amenities for some of the units. So if somebody wants to keep a horse, we should have some sort of requirement for them to be able to keep a trailer in some portion of it. Like, even if it's like 5% of the units need to have something like that. The other one, kind of going back to what Kevin was talking about, underground parking, I think it's not a all or nothing deal. I think it's a dial, and that we can kind of dial back and forth. So rather than pushing them to a point where they have to provide all underground parking, I think we could realistically look at setbacks and building heights to the point where we're saying, yeah, you're gonna have to provide some underground parking, but not all of it. So I guess the idea is that we don't want to be known as the town that you can just come in and build the cheapest product, that you need to have some sort of level of investment into that. The other major item that I was looking at is in terms of sightline. And this is kind of going back to the idea of the 2.5 stories, and we were kind of talking about earlier. When I heard of 2.5 story, I was thinking of like split level or something. But one of the things that you brought up was like occupied roof. But what that does to me is that tells me, okay, if you have 2 stories plus occupied roof, yes, you're talking about the overall building height standard, but the other component of that is the sight line. And I know that part of our previous projects that have come before the city is there's a concern about the sight line from the building into the adjacent neighbor's yard. So if you're talking about 2-story, the sight line is very different than if somebody's basically a 2-story on a deck, which is essentially a 3-story building. And I'd like to see that further clarified into when you're talking about 3 stories, if that's 3 stories plus a roof deck, which I wouldn't want, but I want to see some clarifications on that.
Thank you, Jeff. I have a question. Could we also have them meter each apartment for water?
Yes. Yeah, I believe that's required.
Because my understanding is they can waive that. They can actually waive that. We had this discussion in one of the mayor's meetings where they can come in and say, "Whoop, you're stopping us from building, so we're just going to meter the building." So I don't know.
State standards require for conservation require individual metering so that you could budget each individual apartment their allotment if there was a drought time period. So I haven't heard anything to that as far as limiting that, but for right now, that's not something you could just waive or disagree, because pretty much most cities are putting in standards that every individual apartment is being metered.
Okay.
But we could look into that.
And then the other thing is, I don't know, it's kind of silly. Can you make this look like a western town?
That is the charge your planning director gave us.
All right. Okay.
I'm excited to take that on.
So,
Can I have an alibi? Thanks. A couple of things that I forgot to mention. Number one, I don't see anything related to accessibility or handicap units or handicap parking or anything like that. Is that because it would be covered by something else?
Yeah, the building code will
address all of that?
Yeah.
What percentages have to be what? Okay. And then, I don't know if it would be part of anything we've talked about, but we talked a little bit about animals and animal keeping. Do we want anything about a perimeter horse trail requirement or something along the roads like we have in most of the city?
Your planning staff has brought that up with us, so.
The problem is there's no trail on Hamner, so you'd have to go out the back way.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.
I'm ready.
Yeah. Oh, Danny. The contractor awakes.
It was good. I got to listen to everything real well, and then I'm thinking. A lot of the lighting was brought up. A lot of this is dictated by the building code. Some, like you're saying, 15 feet high. There's a code on the lower lights have to have sensors on them where if a car comes by, they come on when the parking and they shut off like that. When you get higher, they have to stay on more, but they're dictated more. more by the way they're infused to show the lighting in that direction. So the higher you go, they're not automatic. The slower the ones, they have sensors on them, and this is all dictated by the energy code that you have to have. Same as outside wall lights, everything's dictated by the building code of the energy code. So like he's saying, parking, that's already in the building code, exactly how many you have to have. So a lot of this stuff that you're talking about is dictated by the codes already, the building codes, which is it's up to 13 books now. I've worked on a lot of mixed use, but mixed use, the trouble in Norco is usually the commercial part is within walking distance of a few feet to the sidewalk to the front. So then the apartment's above it, like that. So it's not really a setback. You wouldn't have 15 feet, on that part of it. Next thing, I've worked on multiple and got ones that had dictated where the units were on the outside and all the parking was on the inside, where you didn't see the cars because the units covered the parking in the inside, so it wasn't a distraction and looks and stuff. Number one thing is for complaints is lighting on the people that are living next door. I mean, it's unbelievable how much trouble you have with that. Even if you file the code, they want less, but they don't shining in their property and everything. We have that much trouble. The next one I saw, which we have going, they had a high-rise parking in the middle, very ugly, and then all the apartments were around it, like a horseshoe. And then they had multiple parking where you hardly even saw the front face of the apartments themselves. The way it was run. And then you have the subterranean, you were saying, parking underneath. Usually one floor, if it's over 50% of the floor above grade, it's considered a floor. So you're already a half a floor above. So that means you only got one more floor, so you can't go much higher than that unless you go deeper. And it is very expensive, but they do it. I'm around it all the time. Very, very expensive. So there's multiple ways, but each one as it dictates the cost, and that's where someone's going to go. If they get the properties down low enough, they could go underneath, but cost is number one to them, and how many units they can get on it. That's totally the whole thing. You'll have a hard time selling only 2 floors because of the cost. Having that extra floor, to them, that's a lot more money. Not more money doing it, but they're going to make a lot more money because of that reason. Like I'm getting back to it, a lot of the things that we were talking about, which is crucial, is dictated already in the building codes. On the lighting, parking, accessibility. We were talking about lighting and accessibility. You have to have a half a lumens per walking area of going to the accessibility of the cars and stuff like that. So it's already dictated how much lighting you can have. You can't go lower. You can go higher, but you can't go lower.
In the state code, Danny?
Yeah, it's state.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all in the building code. So a lot of this, I know it's brought up. It's how you want to cosmetics, what you want the place to look like from the outside looking in. Like if you were building across the street here, the parking, to me, the building should be on the outside, parking be in the back so you can't see it, but you have a commercial buffer that you can't see all that, which makes it nice. Building like that. If you were building in the parking lot across the street from the city hall. So it depends how it's set up on each side, can make a big difference on if you had housing, if you had commercial, on how to situate it so the looks are looking okay and you're not disturbing people. The biggest thing you're going to complain, people come to this house is when you start disturbing people next door. I think every place should have a 10-foot wall around each building, all the way around the perimeter. Because most of your carports aren't that high, and you wouldn't see carports if they were in the inside and stuff like that. And the lights, cars pulling in at nighttime, that many cars. So I think that should dictate a lot of it right there, is just what's on the perimeter of the project. That's about it.
Thanks, Danny. Anybody else?
Yeah, can I?
Go ahead, Phil.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Go ahead, Phil.
Mr. Newton, yeah, no, I'm also going to apologize to everybody. I have a hard stop at 5:30, so I am going to have to leave. So
Yeah.
Greg doesn't have to hear me ramble, mostly. A couple things that will follow up, and really what I'm looking for is, I think what the intent of the objective design standards is we want to remove ambiguity. And as we were going through, and there was a lot of great suggestions, if this is multifamily. And when we started talking about the mixed use and vertical versus horizontal, there began to be some ambiguity. Both lots in both locations are currently commercial with an overlay. So somebody could come in and put them in as commercial, they could put them in as housing. When we started introducing the commercial, both properties, I'm going to refer to them as properties even though they've got both have frontage in existing commercial areas. So on Hamner, which is one of our primary high density commercial areas, and then over on I think it's Second Street at that point, we've got another commercial area where future development may occur and we want to do it. One buffers on residential, one doesn't. So there's some differences there. Trying to create a code without ambiguity is going to be really hard, to be really specific, because we're really talking about the specifics of two different sites with two different, that we got different levels of grade change, different levels of utility infrastructure that penetrates a site. So I think, and the nice thing about the way the code was, or the way the code is we had some flexibility in how we attack this, right? Or how it could be approached. So without saying we're either supporting or denying a developer had a limit of had few limits on their creativity to try to bring a project forward. So as we're looking at these zoning standards or design standards or development standards, I think it is important that we try to do our best to eliminate the ambiguity so that we get what we want for the citizens in Norco, but also that a developer can come in with clear guidelines. If we decide you've got to have an open space of, I'm just going to throw out a ridiculous number, 20% built space, everything else has got to be, it's mandatorily going to be underground parking if it even became economically feasible. They would obviously try to increase the density and so on and so forth. The other thing is that in an effort to reduce ambiguity, I think we got to be real clear about where you measure the height from. Height of the building, height of the 10-foot wall. Do I measure it on the neighbor's side or on my side? There's some issues there. When we start talking about setbacks, we've got street setbacks and we've got setbacks to adjacent zoning. We want to be real clear there. There were two things that came up that I think are of huge value and are particular to Norco and communities like Norco. One is this idea of recreational leisure spaces that include an amenity for children and agrarian lifestyle. There's something in there, and I don't know specifically how you do it, but that is a key element to what we have in Norco that's different than, say, even neighbors like Eastville and Corona. The other one is this idea, we've spent so much time and effort on our streets and trails to try to get continuity to our trail system and to our pedestrian system. The vehicle system is about all it's ever going to be, but we've got an opportunity to, let's just say I'm up at I don't even care, I'm at City Hall, and I'm going to go over here to visit a friend. It would be nice to have a nice way to walk over there, but even more so if somebody were over here at the senior center and they wanted to go for a walk, how nice would it be to just be able to go through? So that the elements themselves have an integral part of the community, so that pedestrian or equestrian connection, I don't know specifically how we do it other than to say it's that it must connect with the existing pedestrian or equestrian where applicable, because to your point, we don't have horse trails on all of these streets. Over by 2nd Street, I think you can get connected, but it's pretty obscure, and there's a few, where you can come out behind here, there's a few, but I think that would be critical. And then the other one, I understand, I understand that these standards for off-street parking for density are they're commonly accepted. They're commonly accepted because it was the limit. It was the limit the developers were willing to go to, that the communities were willing to accept. Doesn't mean we have to accept them. I have never, and I can say this since probably college, never been in an apartment complex where there was ample parking. They've got people parked in fire lanes and people in front of mailboxes, people parked outside of gates that say do not parking. So I think if we're going to be responsible to our community, there's probably a good reason, because if we end up with people out on the streets in the industrial areas or the residential areas, it's probably not to anybody's benefit. The issue, and it was a great one, the issue regarding large vehicle, we almost don't have a need for compact. You might say we have a need for bicycle, but I mean, when you look at some of the places where we put the compact, we put them as far away from whatever the venue is because nobody parks in them, or they take two. So there's probably something there. There's probably some value in that idea that we're going to parking. It also may inherently become a development, it might make it a little less attractive to a developer we don't want. A challenge to the developer we don't necessarily, that we're not going to embrace. How about that? The issue, and I don't know specifically how to address it, but there is a clear issue that I heard and I agree with. We've got proximity to other people's properties and some distance or setback there, and we've got lighting standards that we want to do so that it's safe. We want to maintain a certain amount of circulation. It does become a fairly complex math problem to be able to solve all that, but I think if we can put clear standards that the wall, whatever the wall is, lighting is attached to the wall to illuminate the areas next to the wall as opposed to something that's in the middle of the property illuminating out. Trying to consider some of those are quantifiable. A developer could look at it and go, I got it. I got to run conduit. I got to put light fixtures onto the wall, however we measure the height of the wall. I appreciate the idea that we're trying to land on something that's specific. And so if without another way to do it, I do think there's probably a way to describe the square footage of dwellings as it's associated with the relative size of the units. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we can dictate the mix of units. Is that correct? We can't say that they're predominantly 2-bedroom units because we believe they're going to be families, right? We can't say the mix.
Most communities don't dictate the mix. I know a few that have. I'd have to investigate if they had special authority.
If
to
you
do
could,
that.
because we don't want to become rental nation, but if we're going to encourage young families or people that are coming here and this is a starter of some sort, then maybe it's appropriate for us to have less studios, maybe more bedrooms, something appropriate. But to what extent we could understand that would it would come when this comes back to the planning commission, that'll be a question that I'll have at that time. So I think that'll wrap it up for me. Thanks.
I got a little bit more.
Yeah.
A little bit. I like to see, because I've seen so often, mostly in apartments, is they have an area that they can put a bike in a room. They have rooms on each floor where you can work because people are really into bicycles. And then it doesn't look good outside, and plus they're out in the weather and stuff, but they do. I've been on 2 projects where they had specialized rooms that so you could bring your bike in and store it in the floor you're in. Another thing I see a lot of, I don't like having a separate washer and dryer place, laundry room place. Just a disaster that every unit should have its own washer and dryer. And about it.
Yeah, I going off of what Phil said, one of the things about our senior center, and I don't know if we can be specific, the dialysis center is right on the other side of, if we build in the field next door. Is there a way that you can have, and that our seniors have to go down the street along Hamner, then walk up this hill? Can you include things like pathways where they literally could go from the senior center? Because it's actually, that's why they're so successful. It's like a community. There's stores, there's Dr. Nelson's, there's the dentist. Can you include things like that there's pathways for non-residents to go through or along?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's kind of compelling about the fact that we have so few properties that we're looking at, as opposed to hundreds of properties in other communities, is that we potentially can include some specific maps of those properties to address the trail issue, both for pedestrians and the equestrian trails. And we will be exploring that because I think that's a kind of compelling option to look at. But we haven't done that in other communities. Like I said, other communities were writing standards for hundreds of lots across the entire community.
Thank you, Phil. Greg?
Yeah, I'll wait till Phil leaves so I can talk about him.
Can you believe what he said?
I know. Tried training that boy a long time ago. Kind of the thought that I'm having on this is that we're going to have different categories and then subcategories, and we're going to just be breaking that down. Like in your standard distance between buildings. And then that category will have a bunch of subcategories. Is that kind of how
Yeah, that's
or
correct.
kind of how we're
That's probably
approaching
what
this?
will end up happening is there'll be
Okay.
large categories and then there'll be subcategories of regulations
So it,
and standards.
and let's say specifically under that distance between buildings, and there was some discussion on that, minimum distance between buildings is controlled by the Uniform Building Code.
Correct.
Can we move away from that minimum? And let's say you have 15 foot, can we say 35 feet between buildings? Or with SB 35, do we just have to meet minimums?
No, you don't have to just meet the minimums. That's part of the reason we're going through this exercise is if we don't have this in place, the building code is the minimum standard, and provided
Okay.
they meet the building code, they walk in the door.
And then another category, say like permitted coverage. For our residential properties, it's 40%. You had 60%. Is that 60% somewhat of just like a sweet spot for developers?
It's
Or,
just-
I mean, what's the
I don't-
basis for 60?
I think if a developer walked in the door, their sweet spot would probably be like 90.
Right.
Ergo Santa Barbara.
Yeah. So 60% is just a number that's been, it's a common number for multifamily development at about the 20 units an acre. It's could be pushed or pulled, I think.
I'll kind of disagree with Danny just a little bit on
Just a little?
just a little on the development, because I think with development on apartments, the sweetest spot where they make the most money is at 2-story, 16 units per acre, and that
16?
16 per acre. I mean, they're still making money at 20 and they're making money at 30, but the ultimate dollar is in that range. And that's why I was kind of looking at, can we push down that 60 to 55? I mean, how much
I
push
think
or
we can look
pull?
at
I
that,
mean,
yeah.
and I think that's for more discussion, but it kind of seems 60%, just because it's a common number doesn't, can we challenge it?
Right. Yeah, I think you could. I think we can look at some different ratios, and I think the ratio of how much percentage of open space is required at grade sort of figures into that.
Okay. And then I had another category which I called, and it was brought up about horse trails around the perimeter, community edge, and that the edge of this community, whether it has horse trails and how it would relate to the wall and fence plan, and that we would take a wall and fence plan and, like Phil mentioned, like let's say when it's adjoining an existing property, we say masonry walls 10 foot in height, taken from finished surface. At least there's a benchmark there that we can use. Past that, would we be able to develop the fence and wall plan to say that, it can be masonry, it can be wrought iron, tubular steel, and no chain link fencing?
Yes.
We
Yeah.
can condition it that way?
Yeah, we could put in design criteria that says that fences
Okay.
have to be of this kind of material, and we could say no chain link, for example.
And then the wall and fence structures, like setback areas, then that could morph into like the landscape requirements where we could get more specific on size of trees, size of plants, and landscape coverage.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can look into that.
It's a good start. Thank you.
Mark? Yeah.
One more question. These design standards that we're talking about now only, as I understand it, only apply to the SB 35 administrative approval process, right?
Correct.
If somebody wants to go through the normal process, nothing would preclude them from doing that.
Correct. And kind of the example I would give is if somebody is not providing affordable housing it's 100% market rate condo development. They're going to pull out top dollar out of every single unit. I don't believe you have to give them this pathway.
Right, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have the flexibility to have two sets of standards, right? One for the affordable housing and one for everybody else.
That is kind of what the SB 35 is set up into place.
Yeah.
I think one of the benefits you will have at the end is that you will have a pretty detailed set of design expectations for any development, whether it's affordable or market rate. So a market rate developer comes to the planning commission, you would hold up the design standards to them and say, this is what we expect out of affordable development. Why are you not giving us something even better?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Jeff.
Kind of quick and simple question that kind of went off of what Danny was talking about with bike parking and stuff like that. Can we embed a design standard into this one? And I'm talking about if we are able to require like a LEED silver versus just the Cal Green requirements.
I don't think you can go that far.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
You know, Greg said something very unusual. Actually, he did a good job, and I'm trying to figure it out. 16 units per acre. That's pretty awesome. Our HDO standards, Alma, correct me if I'm wrong, they can go up to 30 units per acre.
Yes, minimum 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre, and they can go up to, you know.
And I agree with Greg. Because I know he's not putting that much money into it, as when you go up higher, it costs you more, and yeah, they get as many units on an acre as they can because that's how they intend to rent them or lease them or sell them out. And I'm looking at this so if we were to go with something lesser, we actually have to change over our HDO zoning thing too, wouldn't we? Or we don't?
On those two sites, you can't go less than 20 to 30 dwelling units.
You can't go less than 20.
Not.
So, I mean, I like the 16, so we would not be able to put that in this zoning, and John's going to...
That's not an SB 35 issue. That's an Affordable Housing Act issue, and our housing element. That we don't really have the...
John, can you speak into your microphone or turn it on?
Oh, come on, you don't want to... It is on. You don't want to hear me. It's that question really... Unfortunately, there's so many overlapping laws that is not literally an SB 35 issue. It's an issue of the Affordable Housing Act issue, which of course doesn't necessarily apply to Affordable Housing Act, and our housing element, which is approved by HCD.
Well, this goes back to his question on the lot coverage at 60%, 50%, or where do we draw this? You're asking for these design standards, and I'm just trying to figure out how do we work them in there so that our design standard isn't shoving 30 units per acre on there.
And it becomes even more complicated when you have to look at the criteria of whether or not we're discriminating against affordable housing. I mean, even SB 35 says you can't do that. So, two different standards. To the extent that it might make affordable housing more difficult is also not permissible.
So we can't change that because we already in our
Fortunately,
HDO.
we're exempt from SB 10.
Okay. It just what Greg said. That's very interesting to try to look at your percentage because we're going to look at this 60% as a possibility, or do we do it less? And I agree with Greg. It's doing it less and.
One of the things that I did discuss with the consultant, Alan, is that we have to make sure that these development standards don't preclude the minimum density, which is 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre. So we gotta be realistic in our approach as far as the development standards. And I believe, Alan, correct me, you will be doing some kind of layout to take a look at what has been provided to him to see if it's going to preclude the minimum density, then no, it can't be a requirement.
Okay, that's why I was asking the question. That's why I thought the HDO determines that.
That is correct.
Okay.
The HDO zone has determined the minimum density.
Okay,
You're corrected. Yes.
I mean, but I like Greg's thinking on it, so that's what I'm asking.
What does 20 to 30 mean? Can you say 20, or can the developer come in and say, we're going to do 30, or do we determine if it's 20, or they do? So they can build, so really what it is they can go up to 30 units.
They can go up to 30 and possibly higher with the density bonus, so.
But correct me if I'm wrong, permitted coverage area doesn't affect density. I mean, it affects the number of total units you could build on that property, but it doesn't prevent you from getting to the 20 or 30 per acre.
No, unless you've effectively
Unless you go up, but you,
well, unless you've
but you've
effectively
already limited
precluded
that.
it by saying you can't go any higher than 10 feet off the ground.
right, but if we go to 50% permitted coverage, or God knows even want to 40% permitted coverage, in that 40%, you'd still be able to meet the lot density requirements that are in the plan, right?
Assuming that you've calculated that that doesn't preclude, because you've established a height or however you want to characterize it, a height limit, which would preclude them from doing that.
Yeah,
although at least we're down to underground parking and things like that, so who knows?
we're going to be looking at doing some site development scenarios for these, 4 odd particular sites, testing some of these to see, are we adopting or proposing standards that are going to make it essentially impossible to hit this 20 to 30 unit number. So for example, if you went to 40 unit or 40% lot coverage at 2 stories, I can say certain measure of confidence, I don't think anybody's going to hit that 20, even 20 units an acre. The comment about 16 units an acre, I would actually tend to agree with, because if you look up and down throughout Southern California, what you see a lot of development is, I call them the 3-story townhome, where the first floor is a garage, 2-car garage. There's a small entrance, and then you go up, and the second floor over the garage is all your living room, kitchen, and then there's bedrooms on the 3rd floor, and there may or may not be a roof deck, and that just gets packed in as tight as can be. That maxes out at about 20 units an acre. Like it's really hard with that development prototype to go more than 20 units an acre. It really is about 16 if you want any kind of amenities. And the reason it's so profitable is there's no underground parking, there's no insurance, the liability of having somebody live over somebody else is all gone because everybody's living over their own garage. So if my bathtub leaks, it doesn't leak on my downstairs neighbor, it leaks on my car. Parking is all self-contained. People like having parking on site and within their own unit. Like, that's a really desirable kind of building product and kind of living situation. And it is about 16 units an acre. And it's the cost of, and the cost of building that and the cost of delivering that is very low. But you can see, and I've seen some examples down the freeway, or on the 215 right off the freeway. They're just packed in, and it's like that just looks like
Valley. Yeah.
I don't know. I drive past some of those, and I sort of think that's the stucco equivalent of the sort of the slums of like industrial England.
Catherine?
I didn't have anything to say, but I did live in one of those, and it was very nice. in Eastville, and it was affordable, and we saved our money, and then guess what? We got to move to Norco. So there is something to be said for allowing people to get their foot in the door and get affordable housing. Now, I did have one other question, thank you, and it's a little on a tangent, but because these standards are looking at someone who's coming in with affordability. What if someone is coming in with no affordability? Is there a way to adopt or incorporate, can we have standards, zoning for the HDO zone that would set this up already for a developer who does not want to they want to do luxury housing, for example?
Norco, unfortunately, as we have discussed, has no standards at all, so you can adopt standards which apply across the board.
But would it be creating a new zone or just apply to the HDO zone?
What Alan and I were talking about, I mean, rather than creating 2 sets of standards, if it's a project that does not include an affordability component, this would become your base development standards, which, then that project has to go to the planning commission. If they want a waiver, a little here and there, that might be considered, but at least this creates a base to create some design criteria. It's got to be Western, if it's adjacent to a residential zone, you have to be a minimum so many feet away. So we can incorporate, am I correct?
Yes.
Yes, rather than coming to 2 separate standards, at least we have
2 hogs per apartment.
Okay.
What, they're laughing, I'm not.
And I have a lot of chickens now that I've moved to Norco. You say you're going to get
Right.
5 and you have like a lot.
Started with chickens and now he's on.
Do we have any other comments? Are we where you need to be? Have you been given enough stuff?
Absolutely. This has been fantastic feedback. It's absolutely germane to where we are in the process, that we haven't really started to write much of anything. So
Great.
we've got.
What's your timeline on that?
I think I'd have to confirm with staff.
Are
but
you
I
free
think,
next Tuesday?
I think our anticipation was that we'd be kind of working on a bunch
Yeah,
of
I'm
stuff
gonna
over the
call.
holidays, so that.
Okay, so right now, if you don't mind, I'm going to open it up to, are there any public comments?
Mayor, we have no public comments for this item.
It's a closing public comments. Staff, anything else, Andy? Are we good? All right, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. Some incredible comments. I really appreciate Danny in particular. We will now adjourn.
Thank you so much
till,
for your
6
feedback
o'clock.
and time tonight.
I love that. Right, exactly.